Welcome back to the Worst Is Yet to Come podcast. I'm Andrew, and I'm joined by my co-host Harry.
What's up?
Hey, buddy. And today we're going to be discussing the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. So let's jump in right here. We're probably going to break this up into hopefully two parts. Start off with his early life and the French and Indian War, and then we'll break it up into other stuff with the Revolution and his presidency after. So a quick little disclaimer before we start. We won't be committing a whole segment to the topic of Washington and slavery, as he was a wealthy man living in the South, and slavery was very much a commonality amongst the social class at the time. So while it's a touchy subject, we don't want to dedicate an entire segment to talk about it. We'll mention when it's relevant and as we go through his life, but we just don't want to kind of look back with revisionist history on that subject. So, Harry, you want to bring us into our first segment since I think you're more versed in the subject of Washington than I am?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so first of all, doing the research in this episode, even as an American, we don't know we obviously know we're not taught George Washington or the founding fathers before, you know what I mean, the war pretty much.
So everything prior to the Revolution isn't taught in school?
Right, we're taught of oh, there was the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War is, what a lot of British people call it, but we're taught that that's that occurred, and George Washington fought in that, and that's pretty much the extent of it, and it doesn't really go into detail.
Kind of funny because in the Canadian education system, especially being educated in Quebec, I learned about the first people to come that were the French. I learned all about the fur trade, New France, all the way up until the 7 Years' War when the British took over, and they kind of skipped after that to the 60s, Silent Revolution with Rene Lévesque or whatever, and the separatist stuff. So it's kind of funny, we learned the early stuff in school, and then we skipped to the French nationalism stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the War of 1812 in America. Obviously we learned about it, but it's and our White House was burned down, and war ended.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so we don't learn too much about Washington's early life, other than beyond this kind of mythical stuff of
what is it? He never told a lie, and he chopped down a cherry tree.
Yeah, yeah, shit like that. But so he actually did quite a lot of stuff. But I wanted to go into when he was born, where he was born, that kind of thing. So,
well, just before you start, there's a reason why he was in the position he was during the Revolution. Is because all the stuff that happened to him prior, his experiences, and his connections, and all of his networking.
Yeah.
Because he showed up the Continental Congress wearing a militia uniform, kind of showing hey, I'm the guy for the job. I'm wearing this uniform, kind of. But there's a reason why he did that, and there's a reason why he had all these leadership lessons learned.
Yeah, he understood that first impressions will mark how people, look at you moving forward. So, you ever see where people go to court and they go to court in the prisoner uniform, and you look at them and you think they're guilty.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same kind of thing of oh, Washington shows up in a military uniform, so in the Continental Congress, they're immediately thinking oh, a general. And then they're oh, who do we need to be a general? And Washington's right there. It's
he's just sitting right there.
Yeah.
I mean, we're jumping a little ahead, but it's just I wanted to kind of show that there's a reason why he was, where he was when he became so prolific and important, right?
Yeah.
So let's kind of break into his early life.
Yeah. So he was born on February 22nd, 1732. To Augustine and Mary Washington in Westmoreland County, Virginia, which is just a rural, county in Virginia. His father was a justice of the peace. So I know you looked up what a justice of the peace was. We have that now, but it was kind of a little bit different back then. So what did you Did you want to like define that real quick?
Yeah,
What
so like
justice of the peace was? Because I know his father was, and then one of his brothers was Samuel was also a justice of the peace. So you want to like, just tell everyone what that is?
yeah, so like a justice of the peace was kind of a British kind of thing they made up in the medieval times, but essentially it was like you're responsible to the king for ensuring that law was upheld and preserving the king's peace. So that kind of, depending on the jurisdiction, some justices dispensed summary justice or dealt with local administration and common law. It was they're usually appointed or elected by the citizens in which they serve, and they're usually not required to have any formal legal education. So it's pretty much like a I don't know, judge and
Yeah,
like kind of jury and that kind of thing before
yeah,
the whole court system was all properly set up, and it was kind of a way to get people in like affluent positions that like people in like a higher social class can like, oh, he's a trustworthy guy, he has X, Y, and Z, will make him justice of the peace. He'll be the king's representative in the local county or whatever, and
yeah,
he'll deal with local matters of common law. But I thought that was pretty interesting. Where like, you know, right off the bat, his family has some notability.
yeah, yeah. Like, yeah, they're they're known. Like in
Yeah,
Westmoreland County, Virginia, you knew who the Washington family was.
yeah.
Yeah,
Besides being justice of the peace, they had 10,000 acres, and
yeah. I mean, yeah. So, that's Washington's father was a justice of the peace, and a tobacco farmer who owned 10,000 acres and some 50 slaves. On this particular piece of property, he actually owned like a property elsewhere that had more acreage and more slaves at the time also.
was that Mount Vernon? Like because like
No, that
no,
was not. That was not. I don't
no,
think. I don't think so.
okay,
Because he had, I think it was three pieces of property.
yeah. Oh, it's
That
actually Ferry Farm in Fredericksburg,
Yeah, yeah,
Virginia.
yeah.
Okay,
It's they lived there until he was like three,
okay.
and then they moved. I think they moved to Mount Vernon after that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. After his older brother Lawrence inherited that and renamed it Mount Vernon. Okay,
Okay, so Washington had from his mother and father, from Augustine and Mary Washington, he had six siblings. I'm sorry, five siblings. There were six children total.
yeah,
His father Augustine did have children from a previous marriage, like you were saying, Lawrence.
yeah. Right, his half
Um,
brother. Yeah,
yeah. But I just wrote down his birth, you know, from his mother and father. His six siblings. I just wanted to go in a little blurb about them, or the ones that were prominent to some extent. So his eldest sibling was his younger sister Elizabeth. Um, his oldest brother, or the brother younger than him, but was the second oldest brother was Samuel, and that was the one that is, I guess, the most known in Washington's kind of like lore. It's that he's the one that was sick. He had tuberculosis,
okay. Which is
and
a terrible disease.
yeah, yeah. You're just like coughing up blood and shit.
Yeah.
Getting like those nodules in your throat and shit from coughing so much.
Yeah.
So he also served as a justice of the peace. So Samuel served as a justice of the peace for less than a year, because he was one of 115 signatories of a petition of protest against the Stamp Act in 1776. The petition was called the Leedstown Resolutions. And I know we wanted to pause here because you wanted to kind
Yeah. So the
of
Stamp
define the
Act, right?
Stamp Act.
Yeah. So the Stamp Act is the act of British Parliament in 1765 that exacted revenue from the American colonies by imposing a stamp duty on newspapers, legal documents, and commercial documents. Colonial opposition led to its repeal in 1766, and that helped encourage the revolutionary movement against the crown. So this is something that I kind of remember from reading about, is like the Stamp Act. Like I said, you had to pay like a tax, right, a stamp on newspapers and legal documents and commercial documents, right? So if you
Yeah.
wanted to get anything done legally, like paperwork wise, you would have to get this paper, like paper for it, which was already taxed. Or if you want to
Yes.
get a newspaper, the paper would be taxed. So this is where the Americans started kind of
And, yeah.
getting getting a little angry that like, hey, you need us to use your system of bureaucracy and you're tasking us for it. But I
Right.
mean, we can go into the taxes when we get close to the American Revolution, but
Yeah.
I have a different take where I think the taxes on the Americans were justified, where Americans will definitely disagree with me.
Right. Well, so yeah. Um, and so the Leedstown Resolutions was a petition of, prominent men in the Leedstown, Virginia area. Um, and actually, Washington's three brothers from his mother and father, Samuel, John, and Charles, all signed the Leedstown Resolutions. They were three of the 115 signatories of this petition. I'm sorry. Um, so that kind of shows that, Washington wasn't the only, you know, person in his family who disagreed with, the crown authorities and that kind of thing. Um, so Samuel served as a colonel in the Virginia militia, but resigned in 1777 due to his illness. So that's what he kind of did at the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
But he had tuberculosis, so he resigned his position because he was sick. I guess it got worse. This is actually interesting. He was a vestryman, which was in Anglican churches. I wasn't familiar with this because just Anglican stuff isn't too
Familiar to
prominent.
us.
Yeah, like prominent in like
Well,
American society.
yeah, because you guys have what are they, Episcopalians, you said?
Yeah, Episcopalian.
Yeah, they're the Anglicans that broke off from England and
Yeah.
continue on with the
So
Anglican traditions.
like a vestryman, Samuel, and actually, um, their younger brother John was also a vestryman, and a vestryman was someone in an Anglican parish who was like oversaw the like social services of that parish. So like the helping to feed the poor, clothe the poor, or that kind of thing. So he was in charge of that,
Which
which I
I think it's
thought was interesting. I thought that was
well,
interesting.
well, I think it's really important that like a man in an affluent position who has money and property took up the role of leadership in his local parish to give back to the poor and the people that need help. And that kind of speaks to the values instilled in that family and their family members from like, their religious kind of background and
Yeah,
like the family teaching things like that. So it's a really important thing going forward that knowing that like these family was taught to like mean well and give back and kind of serve others, which is a theme throughout Washington's life is service to others before self. And I think it's important that like, his brother here is leading by example where Washington clearly saw this and kind of maybe that stuck with him about serving others.
yeah. And I just want to mention that because I thought it was interesting. And
Oh yeah, no, I think the point I just brought up that just came to my mind is actually a really important thing that like, a young man sees an influent member of his family serving other people, and then his whole life would be service to others.
yeah,
So it's pretty
and
interesting.
then so then Samuel passed away actually in 1781 at the age of 46 from tuberculosis. So and next we have John Washington. As I said, he also signed the Leedstown Resolutions, which is that petition against the Stamp Act. He served as a colonel in the Virginia militia during the Revolutionary War, and he was also a vestryman in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Um, and then the youngest brother, Charles, again, also signed that Leedstown Resolutions, and he actually founded the town of Charlestown, Virginia. And other than that, Charles kind of didn't do too much except, obviously, I would imagine just, be wealthy probably.
I didn't know
Uh,
that. Yeah, he founded a town. That's pretty interesting in Virginia. Wow.
yeah, and they had two younger sisters, Jane and Mildred, which both died in childhood. I think one of them was around 8, and the other one was around 5, maybe. But they both passed away tragically when they were children, which is like super common at the time.
Yeah, I mean that also
Yeah,
adds to the life expectancy numbers back in the day. You said, "Oh, life expectancy was so
yeah,
low." It's like, well, the people that lived, but the people that didn't survive childhood or get into adulthood lower
yeah,
those numbers.
yeah. Like if you, I forget what it was. Like if you lived over like the age of 5 or something, it was like the odds of you like like if you didn't die before the age of 5, like the odds of you like dying, the odds of you like living to like the age of like 65 or whatever was like
Higher.
87% or something like that. It was like
Yeah, yeah,
it was like so long as you made it to like age 5,
yeah.
you're probably gonna be okay.
Which is like terribly unfortunate. Like, I don't want to get a little off topic here, but like people would die from like tuberculosis or whatever these diseases are now, and it's like, oh, for us, you get a shot when you're a baby, no
Yeah,
factor, move on with your life.
yeah,
So I mean, that's it's kind of
yeah,
sad.
yeah, yeah. It was a common. I mean, they had 6 children, and for the time, 4 of them making it into adulthood is pretty good, probably.
Yeah,
But I mean, still, like you have like you just look through history and you see like just normal people having like 5, 6, 7 children, and like 2 or 3 of them die, and that's just like normal. And we just like couldn't imagine that now.
something that I
Um,
found pretty interesting is like Washington. He didn't have real formal education that his brothers received, but he kind of did attend a church school, and he learned mathematics, trigonometry, land surveying, and he became like a talented draftsman and map maker. So like,
yeah, like a surveyor.
yes, like he eventually does like surveying and land speculation later on in life. But like, I think like him being good at like mathematics and trigonometry kind of ties back into what we were saying in like previous episodes about like these really smart military men were drawn to like, I don't know, the proper like education, like say like we talk about Napoleon being an artilleryman because he was smart with mathematics,
Yeah,
trigonometry.
they
Stonewall
were.
Jackson excelled in mathematics, trigonometry, and he was did land surveys in the army
Yeah,
too. So like some of these great military leaders have this kind of common thread where like, I don't know. I think they're good with math and like land surveying and map making and trigonometry. Like, I don't know. It just seems like some of these skills in other prominent leaders we've discussed carries through to George Washington.
yeah, that like practical, logical way of looking at something, like looking at a
Yeah,
problem and figuring like, oh, how do I go about solving this problem?
exactly. Yeah, they're good problem solvers. That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
And,
So, uh, would you want to add something?
oh yeah, there's just a couple more things. Like yeah, he just kind of got his surveying license after when he was a little bit older, and he pretty much just kind of did some stuff around the area. Like he did some surveys of west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He bought a bunch of acres of land in the what's past the Blue Ridge? Is that the Ohio Valley? Or
Yeah, I think so.
yeah, yeah. So he bought 1,500 acres in the valley, and he ended up owning 2,300 acres. But just that kind of thing, like it kind of led to him doing land speculation and surveying. And besides that, I mean, I don't know if he wanted to break in his military career, but there's a couple things about, he went down to Barbados with his brother Lawrence, hoping it would help cure his tuberculosis. On
Yeah,
that trip,
yeah,
Washington got smallpox.
yeah. It's funny. Like actually, two of his brothers had tuberculosis, and I actually misspoke earlier. It was actually Lawrence, the one that's like known to have had tuberculosis, because I think Lawrence actually died before the.
Yeah, he died in 1752, and
Yeah, so
then
yeah, so Lawrence is the one that I meant to say had was the one that was kind of more known, and that he was his half brother, right? And just going off of what you were saying, the education, Washington kind of got the short end of the stick because his uh his half brothers from his father's previous marriage, they actually like received schooling like in England. They were like sent to England
yeah, yeah.
and
Was it
educated in England.
Appleby Grammar School in England?
Yeah,
It says, yeah,
and but it kind of cool to see this kind of shifting. The culture's like shifting towards like the colonies being more independent, and
yeah,
because you see, just like 10 or so years difference, like from when like Lawrence would have got an education to when like George is ready to start receiving schooling, is like the colonies it was more common to educate more kind of well-to-do people in the colonies. It was starting to become, it wasn't too common, but it was becoming more of a common thing to educate them in the colonies, like at home, rather than sending them into England.
Yeah.
So you kind of see this a little, a little bit more. You kind of see just in little stratas of society, like, oh, the colonies are, relying a little bit less on England for some stuff, including the education of their, wealthier class of people, and Washington and his brothers with Augustine and Mary. So the ones I mentioned, they were educated in the colonies, as to where
A
his
lot of
half
I think
brothers were educated in England.
a lot of other founding fathers were actually born in England or educated in England, but Washington is kind of that
Yeah,
different guy
the
where he was
yeah
born in America and kind of, got his, base education in America. So
yeah,
that's pretty interesting.
but
You want to go over, I'm just saying, like, his brother Lawrence died um in 1752, and Washington leased Mount Vernon, so that all that acreage, property, plantation
yeah,
from his widow Anne, and then he eventually inherited it outright after her death in 1761.
yeah. So with Washington inheriting Mount Vernon, which is a like huge estate that his father owned, and that had gone to Lawrence, and then when Lawrence passed away, it went to George. With him inheriting Mount Vernon, you see he was already well to do. He was already kind of being molded into being like, oh, he's going to be a prominent man in the area. You know what I mean? That kind of
Yeah.
way back then. But with him inheriting Mount Vernon, he kind of really has the opportunity to stand out as someone who's very wealthy and very um, privileged as compared to he had more of a humble upbringing somewhat than like you look at like him and then you look at like the super wealthy who had like deep ties to like historically
The old money
yeah, yes,
families.
from like England, you know what I mean, that were tied to
Yeah.
like dukes and earls and shit in England. You know what I mean? You see
Yeah.
those guys in the colonies, and then you see like George Washington, who was
He
like
was the new money compared
yeah,
to old
this
money.
yeah, the son of a
He,
judge and a tobacco farmer who
he like
very much made he was his own man. He made himself essentially like
yeah, the family became self-made
yeah, he had a fucking huge head start
plantation.
in yeah,
Yeah.
he had a huge head start in inheriting Mount Vernon, but he, like you said, he rented it from Anne, his, sister-in-law, and he, he developed Mount Vernon into, what it became. So with that, you see him kind of shift to being more prominent within the colonies, and that's where I wanted to get into starting his military career, which is actually before the Continental, before he was the leader of the Continental Armies in the Revolutionary War, like in the before the French and Indian War, and during the French and Indian War, he was actually uh, very prominent. So he so in 1752, you said he went to Barbados with Lawrence.
Yeah, with Lawrence, yeah, because I guess the idea was that the humidity down in the tropics would be better for that kind of person's condition. And
Yeah,
I've heard this a lot throughout history where people will seek warmer climates when they have
yeah,
health issues.
yeah,
I mean,
and
I'm not a doctor, I don't know, but I mean,
yeah,
at the time, it seems like that was the medical practice.
yeah. Um, so in 1752, Washington was actually so he was actually inspired by
Lawrence,
Lawrence, who was I think he was a general in the Virginia militia.
adjutant general.
Yeah, okay. So he was actually inspired by Lawrence, essentially, who was in the Virginia militia as an officer. And
I
Washington, obviously through those connections, was made a major in the Virginia militia.
think during that time, it's really popular for people to be in
Yeah,
the militia. It
yeah,
was more of like a social club and like more of like
right, yeah,
a kind of like a get together with your neighbors kind of thing, more than it was an actual drilled military
yeah,
unit, right? When you think of like militia, you think like, oh, they're like reservists. They train, 1 weekend a month, and then maybe 1 day a week, like they do here in Canada. But like at the time, militia was like you're part of the militia. You get a fancy uniform. You get together on an annual basis for like a drill weekend where it's just everyone sitting around drinking, kind of shooting the shit, and you call yourself the militia. And then if things go down, you got to rally the guys. But like at this time, it wasn't like a well-disciplined militia that
Yeah,
maybe even fought during the revolution. This was just like a bunch of country dudes
yeah,
hanging out with like the rich plantation owners being the
yeah.
officers, and you get a weekend together thing.
Yeah, yeah, and so if you were like just kind of give people perspective, if you were an up and coming, you know, young wealthy man, you would have been an officer in the militia. That would have been one of the kind of, either that or some kind of like public office at the time, in civil service or some kind of thing like that, like a
Yeah.
justice of the peace. That you would have done one of those things because that's essentially like a rite of passage is.
It's also a way to climb the social ladder. Like
Yes, and
at this point, everything's based off the British system. Well, what did you do with like the second, third, and fourth sons of a noble family in England? You threw them into the army so they can climb the ladder.
yeah, so and that's the exact same way it was in the colonies. Like you join, and then especially back then too. It's like even now, the officers dying.
Yeah, the
It's
mess
it's two di-
separately. It's a mess culture,
yeah,
two different worlds.
it's two different worlds. So
Yeah,
the officers dine with the other officers. They socialize with each other.
they go hunting together, all that kind of stuff.
And this is really where Washington has the opportunity to witness the like you were saying it was, at this time it was like the British culture,
Yeah,
but most certainly it was flourishing into its own culture, being a colony for so long.
yeah,
It was certainly getting its own, forming its own culture, but it was still very much ingratiated in like this is the British way of, this is the officers' culture and this kind of thing. So Washington saw, what is a gentleman, he saw like the gentleman officers and, what makes a gentleman and that kind of thing. And that kind of forms his thinking going ahead of like what is a proper officer and like who he witnessed as an officer. And just that became like, at the time, if you wanted to climb the social ladder, like you were saying, one of the ways you do that is in joining the militia and being an officer. And like it's like you were saying, like it's not, they're not so much fighting, if they're, it's the militia, so if they're fighting it's pretty bad.
yeah,
um them, back then it meant like the natives are coming, the French are coming, whoever.
yeah,
And if you're the militia and you're fighting, it's bad. You know what I mean? That'd be like if someone invaded Canada and you're in the street fighting. Like
yeah.
that's that bad.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it's almost like a Red Dawn scenario where it's like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah,
we gotta get the militia together. Like, we're the regular redcoats. Like, damn, you know?
yeah. So yeah, that it was a social club. So there wasn't too much fighting. So essentially it was like you're saying, it's a social club for the officers, which they use to like, they use to like network and that, that kind of thing. Like, oh,
Yeah. And then for the enlisted men, it's like you're farmers, you have rifles, you need to, get together with your neighbors, and
yeah,
like
you
you
need
just
to
have
know.
to.
Yeah,
It's almost like you have to do it because every man is doing it, kind of thing.
yeah, it's like a fraternal order. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You're in the militia. When it came down to it, you're gonna fight next to your neighbor for his and your family and your property and that kind of thing. So just going into that, he became he got a commission as a major in the Virginia militia, which a major in the Virginia militia at the time, the Virginia militia was split into four like districts, I guess, like
yeah.
military districts. So at the time, a major was, there was four, I guess, and the majors were the commanders of the four districts. So he was one of the majors in the Virginia militia and one of the commanders of of one of the militia's four districts. So he was appointed that in 1752. In October of 1753, he was sent by the rural governor Dinwiddie, I think was his name.
Okay, can I just circle
Robert
back
Dinwiddie.
before 1 second? While we're back in the 1752 sphere, Washington is about the age 20 at this point, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and this is also the first time that he joins the Stonemasons, which is kind of, or the Freemasons, which is when we get back to like the Revolution, it's kind of gonna play a kind of an important role with certain people because they have that like Masonic brotherhood with like certain people. But I just want to throw that in now that at this time, at age 20, he actually joins a lodge in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and he becomes an apprentice Mason. And that's gonna come into play later. I just want to mention that. So sorry, Harry. Go back to.
No, yeah, that goes into what we were talking about, the networking and the being involved in networking, like socializing with prominent people, and that would play into that later on.
Yeah, exactly.
But so in October of 1753, he was ordered by the royal governor, which I think was I know it was Dinwiddie. I can't remember the first name, but the royal governor of Virginia, Dinwiddie.
Robert.
Yeah, Robert Dinwiddie. Washington was sent to gather intelligence on French positions, as the French at the time had constructed a number of forts in the Ohio Valley, which the British were claiming as part of the territory of the 13 colonies.
Yeah.
So the French were setting up like forts, just dotted throughout the Ohio Valley, and Washington and his men were intercepted by a French patrol, and they were taken to Fort LeBoeuf in northwest Pennsylvania, commanded by a man named Jacques de Saint Pierre. And Washington had the order from Dinwiddie, telling Saint Pierre to vacate the fortifications, all of the French fortifications in the Ohio Valley. Pierre refused, but gave Washington and his men food and clothing to get back to Virginia. So that was in October. So they marched from like Virginia to somewhere in the Ohio Valley.
That was 53
in northwest Pennsylvania. Yeah, 1753.
Okay, because the next year is when the war starts. Okay.
Yeah. So that goes into 1753, and it goes into 1754, like through the winter.
Yeah.
So it took them 77 days to go there and come back. So it's like through the winter.
Yeah, which has got to be terrible. I know you as a boy from Texas, you don't experience the snow, but I could tell you, trudging through the snow isn't that fun.
Yeah, like Pennsylvania is. Oh God.
Yeah, I mean,
just yeah.
I can't imagine a 77-day expedition through the snow. I've gone winter camping before for a weekend where we kind of walked 5K into the bush, set up camp, kind of shot some guns or whatever. Then we walked out 5K. But like, I can't imagine a 77-day expedition through the snow.
So that was through the winter. So this kept happening back and forth. Like the French would build a fort, and the French were very closely allied with the natives in the area.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too into that because it's an entire thing. It's so complicated as to like why.
Well, there's a lot, and like a lot of these tribes will switch sides, and
yeah.
When we get into talking about the war, I want to bring up
for sure.
A couple things, but yeah.
So the rural governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, because of these rising like tensions, he actually formed what was called the Virginia Regiment, which was not part of the Virginia Militia. The Virginia Regiment was actually a provincial corps. It's like a provincial unit, so it was an actual military unit.
Not part of the militia.
And, it wasn't a militia unit. It wasn't a regular unit. It was an actual military unit. And the provincial corps the only difference between them and like redcoats or the regular infantry was that they were raised one campaign at a time.
Okay.
So Washington, he was promoted to promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he was made second in command of the Virginia Regiment, which at the time was 300 strong, which seems low, but like back then.
I mean, it's a lot of people, especially from the colonies and like on a kind of outskirts area.
Yes.
I mean, something you do notice from like the sizes of the armies of the Revolutionary War, it's very small armies compared to what they'd be fighting with on the European continent.
Oh, yeah.
And especially with like this kind of situation, it's lower numbers, but
yeah, this is like it's very much on the wilderness. It's
frontiersmen,
Yes,
farmers.
yes.
Yeah,
So
we're not pulling from the big cities.
yeah, so Washington was ordered to set out in April of 1754 with 150 men, so half of the Virginia regiment. He set out to confront French troops at the forks of the Ohio, which is actually it's like the forks of the Ohio River, where it like branches off into these two forks, and
Yeah.
in the middle of the fork, the the French built Fort Duquesne there,
Yeah.
and they had 1,000 men. The French had 1,000 men constructing Fort Duquesne and stationed there. So that's actually like a very sizable amount of men in that
So has the
area.
war started at this point, or is this prior
No,
to the
no,
war?
it had not started. It had not started yet. This is before the war had started actually. So this it's
Okay.
just the French like kind of encroaching on. There was a lot of actual like conflict and like
Yeah.
skirmishes between the French and British, but there wasn't actually not actual war. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so something that I got written down is the main cause of the war, which we'll get to, right? The French-Canadian War was caused by territorial disputes between the French and the British in the
Right. Yeah.
colonies of North America, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, which we're talking about. Both nations wanted to expand their influence and control over valuable fur trade routes and strategic territories. So eventually they escalated into conflict in 1754, which we're going to get to, and it spread all across the colony. But the thing, the Ohio River Valley was like mostly unexplored. There's forts around, but it was popular in fur trade. The thing you got to remember is, especially the French at this point, they control Quebec, right? So New France, where
Yeah.
you know where I'm from, where I live, and a large thing about our history is the fur trade. That's what built, you know, Canada essentially was the fur trade. So the French want to kind of expand their influence on the fur trade, and the Ohio Valley, like you said, has all these rivers, right? The forks of the rivers. Well, that's how the Courrier de Bois moved the fur trade, through the areas on the rivers. So
Yeah.
they can control the valley where you can get the fur trade going, control the arterial routes of the rivers. You're making money, and that's what all this is about for the French. And the fur trade is making the money.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny that the fur trade is like the like the business that made Canada kind of
Yeah,
what I mean.
yeah. I mean
It's kind of it's kind
that's
of
why
funny
the
like how like
beaver is our
the
national animal and an iconic thing is the beaver fur and the pelt.
yeah, it's kind of funny like that's like Canada's like I don't want to say cash crop, but because it's like an
Yeah,
American thing, but like the American the thing that like the American colonies were built on was like very much like tobacco and cotton. It was
yeah,
tobacco mostly.
yeah. And then
Then the
us
southern
was
became cotton.
us was the fur trade.
Yeah. Um. So the war hasn't started yet. So he was he was just sent to like do like reconnaissance, like find out their movement, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he was sent with 150 men to the forks of the Ohio, and the Frenchmen where there was 1,000 Frenchmen there, and they had constructed Fort Duquesne in the area. Um, Washington actually set up he set up a fort called Fort Necessity. It's kind of like a little.
Yeah.
It was like a small kind of dinky.
Wasn't it in like a very bad position?
Yeah, it was in the middle of well, I mean, it was in the middle of a field surrounded by
Two hills, wasn't it, or something?
forest. It was like forest, but like so that could conceal the enemy and provide cover for the enemy.
Yeah.
But so they built Fort Necessity just to have a place to fall back to if the French engage them,
Yeah.
and to camp. So, but Washington got word of, I believe it was actually through Washington's native scouts, which there wasn't many because most of them sided with the French, but the natives were doing the kind of the reconnaissance pretty much because they knew the area obviously.
Yeah.
And he got word of an encampment of a smaller encampment of Frenchmen, just kind of down the ways a little bit from where they were,
Mhm.
and they figured, okay, we'll go and you know tell them to get out of the area or leave or engage them or whatever. So this small French, 40 men was commanded by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. And they'd set up camp in a glen, which is like honestly, that's like a very,
Scottish term.
well, yeah, but like that's a glen is like it's like a little area in like it's usually like in a wooded area, and it's like essentially like a valley type thing, but it's like it's surrounded on all sides pretty much.
Okay.
But like, so if you look at pictures of like Jumonville Glen today, that this will come up, and you'll be like, oh, that'd be like a terrible place to set up camp. And so like they set up camp essentially in this like natural crater that was like surrounded by hills and rocks and trees. And this like natural crater down below is where they set up camp. Is where the French set up camp. And so Washington and his men and like a dozen native allies um positioned themselves behind cover surrounding this glen. And as they were setting up, one of the Frenchmen noticed them and, kind of alerted or, shouted something. And Washington immediately told his men to open fire. Um, and the officer, the ensign, the Jumonville, which the glen is named after, was killed immediately. And so were 9 other Frenchmen. One guy was wounded, and 21 were taken prisoner. Uh, Washington and his men retreated to Fort Necessity, where they're joined by the rest of the Virginia Regiment a month later. So this is in May now. So in May, 150 more men come to the area. So there's 300 men, and then they were actually joined by 100 men from a South Carolina like militia company. So there was 400 men in Fort Necessity, and on July 3rd, the French obviously, pissed off that their men got attacked. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Go to look for the Englishmen that did this, and they found them obviously at Fort Necessity, and 600 Frenchmen, and 700. I think it was 600 Frenchmen and 700 native and 100 natives, or like 500 Frenchmen and 100 natives. I forgot to mark it down correctly, but they attacked this Fort Necessity, and the command, like the French commander that attacked Fort Necessity,
Yeah.
was actually the half brother of Ensign Jumonville that had been killed at Jumonville's Glen.
Okay.
So it was Jumonville's half brother, Captain Louis Coulon, that was commanding the unit that attacked Fort Necessity. And this is how like shoddily made the Fort Necessity was.
Oh, it was just thrown together, hence
It
Fort
was.
Necessity.
It was literally like they built like a shack in the middle, like for Washington, I guess, like the headquarters, and then it was surrounded by stakes, and it had a single gate, like a single entrance, and then wooden earthworks. And then I think they had like a little swivel cannon or something.
Yeah.
The one that like you put in the ground with a stake, and then it just, it's a little like it's a tiny cannon. You know what I mean? Like,
It's not that much.
so they on the French side, on the French and native side, 3 of their men were killed and 19 were wounded. This is how crazy. On the British side, they were the defensive side, so they were in the fort and like behind the earthworks. 31 were killed and 71 were wounded. And as I was saying, the fort was surrounded by it's flat grassland and then there's trees. So like the French and natives could just, sit behind the trees and then
Pick them off.
attack. Yeah, yeah, just like. So it was very, costly for Washington and the Virginia Regiment. Um, So after the engagement, Coulon offered Washington and his men the opportunity to return to Virginia if they left. So he's not gonna take them prisoner. He's not gonna do anything like this if they left.
Yeah.
Um, and it's actually funny in doing the research for this. The French commander, Coulon was obviously disgruntled because his half brother died. His brother died, so his brother was killed. Um, he told Washington, that the French had their native allies with them, so it's kind of pointing to the French and British thinking they're better than the natives at the time. I guess the superiority complex of them. So the French commander told Washington, if you come out, we'll let you go and all that kind of stuff. He said, if you don't, I don't know if I can control our native allies, and I'm afraid they'll scalp all of you. So he kind of like, halfway kind of like threatened, Washington that like, if you don't come out, I'll have the natives go in, and kill everyone. So Washington actually surrendered. So this Louis Coulon, this Captain Louis Coulon, is actually significant in that he's the only military leader to ever make George Washington surrender.
See, I got a funny thing about that if you let me come in
Yeah.
here. So Washington believed the situation was impossible, so he accepted the surrender terms, which you just talked about, right? Allowing for peaceful withdrawal from his forces, right? Now, the French eventually occupied the fort and they burnt it down. But Washington did not speak French, and they made him sign a document confessing to the assassination of his half-brother, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, right? But Washington did not speak French, so he stated later if he had known that he was confessing to the assassination, he would not have signed the surrender document.
God, that's funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, the document he signed stated that he said, oh yes, it was an assassination of this incident. You know what I mean? So, just in response to that, that kind of the Jumonville incident, it essentially started. There was catalyst leading up to the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, but the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was the Battle of Jumonville Glen, which is what it became called. That essentially started the French and Indian War. The Britain and France sent troops to America in 1755, the same year that happened. Or it was actually 1754. So that next year, Britain and France actually sent troops to America in 1755 and stationed them in the colonies, their own respective colonies. And war was actually declared a year later in 1756. And the colonial, in this time, over that time in 1755, kind of because of the Battle of Fort Necessity and Washington kind of failing drastically, and he wasn't really meant to engage. He was just meant to go and get information, maybe get into an engagement if you can win, that type of thing, or if the French do something that warrants attacking, that kind of thing.
They wanted him to go there and win if he engaged, not don't surrender, don't lose, don't give up ground. So this is like a strategic defeat more than a tactical defeat, because it was very long-term ramifications.
Yes, it was also very damning to Washington's reputation as a prominent figure and a military man. And actually, the colonial forces were restructured, and so the Virginia Regiment was actually stood down. And Washington was offered, because the unit he commanded didn't exist anymore. He would have had to take in a post as a captain, and instead of doing that, he just resigned. And that led us into the actual French and Indian War. He served as an aide. When the actual French and Indian War happened, they, figured that, despite what he did, we need men with experience actually, and he actually did have experience, which was fair,
Rare.
fair. Yeah, it was rare, and he had experience engaging the French forces and native forces.
He knew the Ohio Valley. He had
Yes,
experience
yeah,
dealing with the French. He had experience like commanding men. Even if he lost, the
yes,
experience
experience. Yeah,
of commanding
experience.
men and the experience of combat is
Yes, it's
more than
valuable.
like
Yeah,
it's value is yeah, exactly. It's
yes.
valuable.
So when the actual French and Indian War, was
Kicked
about to
off.
happen, like is about to kick off, the British already knew, like, no, no, we're going to go to war, essentially. Washington was made a colonel again, or not again, but he was made a colonel, and he was an aide to General Edward Braddock. In Braddock's expedition, which sought to remove the French from Fort Duquesne, that same fort with 1,000 men in it. They were so they actually had a mission to conquer that fort now. So take the fort, remove it from the French's hands, and claim that fort for Britain. So this is a legitimate engagement. It was an expedition. So and Braddock set out with 2,000 men. It was actually a little over 2,000 men and a battery of 10 cannons, which at the time this is like pre-Revolutionary War. These figures are 1,000 men at
That's a lot of men.
Fort Duquesne, and 2,000 men. This is a very sizable campaign. So this Braddock expedition, it's an expedition, but so it's like a mini campaign.
Yeah.
So Braddock set out with a little over 2,000 men and a battery of 10 cannons to attack Fort Duquesne, which was manned by 900 French and natives at the time. Um, from May to July of 1755, that's when the expedition was, like I said, it was a mini campaign, essentially. So from May to July in 1755, 30 French and natives were killed, while 57 were wounded. In the same amount of time, the British again kind of dropped the ball on this, but it wasn't Washington's fault this time. In that same amount of time, over 500 British were killed and over 400 were wounded. So of the 2,000 men, of the roughly 2,000 men they sent that went on the Braddock expedition, essentially like it's like 45% of them, or like just under half of them, are killed or wounded in the matter of like 2 months, 3 months.
Hmm.
So it's a drastic failure on. It's not Washington's fault this time because he's not in command. It's Edward Braddock's fault. He's at fault for this. I think Braddock is actually killed in this expedition. I think Braddock is actually killed. But Washington was actually despite this being a huge failure on the part of the British. Washington's disgrace from the Battle of Jumonville Glen, like the Jumonville Glen incident and the Battle of Fort Necessity, was redeemed during the Battle of the Wilderness, which took place during the course of the Braddock expedition. And in this Battle of the Wilderness, we see Washington. He had severe dysentery for weeks. And despite being sick, rose from his, sick bed and rallied the survivors from an earlier French and native ambush and formed a rear guard that mounted a strong enough defense to allow the rest of Braddock's forces to regroup and retreat from the area instead of, retreating, messily and being slaughtered in the process. You know what I mean? So during the Battle of the Wilderness, Washington had 2 horses shot from under him, and his hat and coat were riddled with musket ball holes.
So I just want to go back to what you said about him having dysentery and him kind of fighting through it to lead his men in the battle, right? So that has to go with a couple good leadership qualities that I think he has, and that would be his resilience, right? This comes back around again and again throughout his military career, but he has resilience to, like, despite whatever challenge he's facing or setbacks, He's always remains resilient and determined, and he perseveres through everything, right? It's inspirational that obviously he's leading his men while sick, right? The men can see that, especially the fact that he had 2 horses shot from under him and his coat is riddled with holes. That means that he is clearly in the fight, up there with his men. Showing courage was another one of his factors. So, like, he's not messing around. He's not one of these kind of headquarters chateau generals like we've talked about before.
Yeah.
He's there's multiple times we will talk about the revolution where he's up doing some of the fighting himself. He'll ride up, observe, but like at this point, like he's leading his men, through dysentery, which is terrible, in the fire, and like that's clearly inspirational for his men, and that's just one of those things that endure his men to him and make him the kind of leader that they want to follow no matter the odds you're going through.
Yeah, and yeah, just like you're saying, it goes to show he was very much in the thick of it. I mean, like you have like guys like him or like Napoleon, who's like very much in the thick of it. Napoleon was like famous for like directly like telling like the artillery like no, he was
Yeah.
he was in it, like telling the artillery like where the artillerymen like where to aim, and this kind of thing, which generals didn't do back then. They stood on a horse and let their men delegate and that kind of thing. Ben Washington was like in the thick of it, so he essentially, despite this being like a massive failure, his exploits of doing this, like essentially being a hero in a situation where like no one's a hero, um word gets out, and he gets this kind of aura around him again, where he no longer has the Jumonville Glen or and Battle of Fort Necessity hanging over him, so he kind of very much redeems himself.
Yeah, it's definitely like that kind of redeeming arc you see. I mean, an important thing is obviously like throughout life, you're gonna fail at things and you're gonna learn lessons from it. And at this point, he's kind of learned his lessons from mistakes that were in his control, out of his control, and that kind of builds the basis of his military career. And going forward, he'll still make mistakes, but he keeps learning from them, and his adaptability to keep going. He's flexible. He's able to adapt his strategy to changing circumstances. He learned from his mistakes and is willing to change his approach when necessary. A lot of people, especially military figures this time, their ego is really high and they're stuck on their ways. They're stubborn. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, Washington is really good at adapting. So this is kind of just proving like, hey, this didn't work. This didn't work. Okay, going forward, let's do this, this, and this. And then him kind of showing his bravery and gallantry in that action kind of rebuilds his, like you were saying, his kind of like outward, I don't know, the way people look at him, right?
Yeah, his reputation.
His reputation, right? So his reputation is rebuilt from his bravery and perseverance on top of the lessons learned. It may be a couple, say tactical defeats on his part, but long-term strategic, they're victories, right? He's winning the long game here with this situation he's been put into.
Yeah. And just kind of wrap it up. This after that, he didn't really do anything the rest of the French anymore. He and the regiment eventually actually did assist in the capture of Fort Duquesne, but only after it was abandoned by the French. So, in his last 10 months of the commander of the Virginia Regiment, he led the regiment in defending 300 miles of Virginia territory against 20 Native American attacks.
What I wanted to say earlier about the Native Americans was my tribe, the Ojibwe, we fought with the French against the British at this point.
Yeah.
So I just want to throw that in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Washington actually oversaw the increase of the size. I said it was 300 at the time in the initial stage. He actually oversaw the increase of the size of the regiment from 300 to 1,000 men, which is significant.
Which is about a standard kind of like battalion size. Yeah. Usually things like 800 men to 1,000 for that time.
And at the time, when we get into talking about the Revolutionary War in the next episode, at the time when they say like regiment or battalion, that they were used interchangeably, and it pretty much meant about like 1,000 men, I think.
Yeah. So from what I understand, because I'm really into British history, is a regiment will exist. Okay, so like let's say we have like let's say like fuck, I can't think of a division off the top of my head. Let's say like Governor General Foot Guards of Canada, right? So the regiment itself exists, and there'll be in this time frame there would be a first battalion and a second battalion. One battalion would be where the 1,000 men are for the fighting and being deployed, and the
Yeah.
second battalion would be based at home. That's where the training depot would be.
Yeah.
That's where they would kind of get men into the second battalion to get them ready for
Yeah.
the first battalion.
Yeah.
So like
Recruit, train.
you,
Yeah.
you could say you're part of like you can use a regimental name, but most of the time these regiments were just one battalion, maybe two.
Yeah.
It's not like now, like I say, the Australians, they have like their I forget the regiment name, but the Australians have like 8 battalions in one regiment. Well, it's different from this system. This system is usually 1 battalion per regiment, or maybe 2, and the second one is a
Yeah.
training battalion, right?
Yeah.
So you could interchange them, like you were saying.
Yeah. So when we say like regiment or battalion in the future, when we're talking about this, it's pretty much 1,000 men essentially.
Most of the time, like due to
It's
wartime
under
conditions,
that.
it'd
Yeah.
be down to
Yeah.
500-600 men maybe,
Yeah.
but on paper it should be between like 8 or 1,000.
Yeah. So just moving forward, that's what we mean when we say regiment or battalion. But so in kind of overseeing this unit grow, he instilled in them greater discipline than before. That's where they were more of a they're better than militia, but not anywhere near like the regular like red coated line infantry. And Washington kind of got them not to that standard, but certainly more effective or capable than the militia. And it just in closing here, we're about to wrap it up, but just in his career as a British colonial officer, all the things we've talked about today, Washington gained battlefield experience, he gained self confidence, and he gained an insightful knowledge of actually the conservativeness of British military tactics. For the most part, there's obviously exemptions to everything or exceptions to everything, but at the time, the British Army was, again, except for some cases, they were fairly conservative, at least in the colonies. And he would kind of take all of these as advantages moving forward. And obviously, we'll get to that when we talk about his role in the Revolutionary War and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, well said. It's just all this stuff laid the groundwork for his future role as commander in chief of the Continental Army during the Revolution.
Yeah, and like we were saying before, that his ability to instill greater discipline in his men, his experience, and that his self confidence, the experience and self confidence is something that you can't learn in like a military college, or you can't learn as part of your schooling. You know what I'm saying? You have to have that from actual battlefield experience and your own ability and success. So, despite his success not being like, this grand, major victories or major campaigns at this point, he knew what it took to lead men, and he knew how to get men to, rise to the expectations that he set for them. And that in conjunction with everything else that he learned, all of his experiences helped him immensely moving forward into the Revolutionary War, which we'll get to on our next episode.
Yeah, I just want to close off with saying, like, people will ask the question, are leaders made or are they born? The answer is yes.
Yeah,
The answer is yes.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to close that out. Because I mean, Washington very much was that way. He was not bred from these guys who were the gentlemanly officers who were supposed to be naturally have this like natural instinct to lead men. This kind of delusional way of thinking back then. It was like, oh, a gentleman knew how to lead men. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
even if he didn't, he's a gentleman, and we shouldn't say otherwise.
Yeah.
But Washington was kind of an exception to that rule, which is becoming more and more common, especially in the colonies at the time. And so yeah, you put that perfectly. It's They're not born, or you don't, you're not born with that. You don't learn that. It's both. It's
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
nature and nurture for you know being a successful military leader and that a leader of men. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, well said. Besides that, we're gonna hopefully do this in 2, maybe 3 parts. I mean, there's a lot of information to cover. There's a lot of offshoots of our conversations, but I want to thank everyone again for listening to what is now our 8th episode of the podcast. So we really appreciate that, especially our friends and family that have been reaching out to us saying, they've been listening and they like it. To all the people that we don't know, thank you very much for listening, and we, are really looking forward to continuing this. We enjoy doing this for fun. And if you have the ability to find us on Facebook or Instagram and Twitter at The Worst Is Yet to Come podcast, and just give us a follow, share some of our stuff, maybe fire us a message or emails in our Instagram, or just send us a message on Facebook or Instagram saying, hey, you like this? You got ideas, criticisms, complaints? We'll take them all. So with that, have a good night, Harry, and thanks for this, buddy.
For sure. See everyone next week.